Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyekolu. Now, nearly 60 years ago, ministers from 23 independent African countries convened in Lagos, Nigeria, for the inaugural meeting of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank. The young institution was assigned a dual mandate: the social and economic transformation of Africa and the economic integration of the continent. Well, let's just say that it's an ongoing mission as far as that original mandate is concerned. But what started as a continental partnership among a handful of African countries has emerged as a model of how Africa and the developed world can work together for mutual benefit. And one of the key partners in that evolution has been Japan. And now the new acting vice president of the bank comes from Japan. She's Atsuko Toda, who's been at the AfDB since 2016 and now takes full charge of the critical Department of Agriculture, Human and Social Development.
So the transformation of the African agricultural food system is happening. When we look internally, we have to know who are the champions. We need to target value chains. We need to target those commercial opportunities. We need to target locations, because investing in everything is just not possible. Finance is difficult to access already, so the question then becomes a narrative around who, what, where do we target? Commercial banks have excellent business intelligence. The point would be to focus more on the agribusiness opportunities. And it's so great to hear Standard Bank saying, yes, we would like to focus on agribusiness and see this as a market opportunity. Banks like the African Development Bank support policy, infrastructure, de-risking these investments. So it's really about what Shola said, the complementarity, the coordination, how we work towards a targeted narrative together and making concrete steps towards that collaboration.
Well, I'm delighted to say that the acting vice president for Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank, Atsuko Toda, joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles.
And I suppose congratulations are in order on your appointment as acting vice president at the AfDB, with a particular focus on agriculture, human and social development. And that's a key sector, isn't it?
It is truly a key sector for Africa in terms of everything that pertains to growth. It's about inclusive growth, it's about green growth, it's about ensuring that women, youth are part of the equation when we talk about economic growth on the continent.
So what are you going to bring to this new and exceedingly important role? Because, I mean, it's generally accepted that Africa needs to develop its agriculture across the entire value chain. And in order to do that, it needs rural development and development finance.
So I think there are two things, Charles. When we talk about African economies, we look at the structure of the economies, and then clearly there's a need for a structural transformation. So with the second term of our President Akinwumi Adesina, it was incredibly important for him to bring the industrialization agenda forward. So it's not just about production, it's about also processing. And to the point of focusing on the entire value chains, when we talk about agro-industrialization, you have the upstream where the farmers are, you have the midstream where the small medium enterprises are, you have the downstream where you have the processors. So all along this chain there are jobs that can be created. So in terms of Africa's growth, agro-industrialization presents an exceedingly huge opportunity. That's number one. Number two, we see the population of Africa growing. By 2050 we're looking at a doubling of the population. What do people spend on first? They spend on food. So when you see cities growing, and cities consume about 60% of Africa's food. You see the need to feed these cities. And so these value chains towards these growing populations, these cities, incredibly important. And thirdly, of course, the youth. You have about 18 million youth coming onto the job market on an annual basis in sub-Saharan Africa. So the opportunities around jobs for youth is incredibly important.
Well, that's the theory. And clearly you've articulated that theory very well indeed. But on a practical level, I mean, we haven't really seen that much dramatic development. I mean, the African Development Bank has been around since 1964. And we haven't seen that massive agricultural transformation that's been talked about like you so, properly articulated it just now.
Thank you. And actually for African Development Bank, which is really Africa's bank, we've put forward a strategy called the High Fives, which includes a particularly important strategy around Feed Africa and improving the livelihoods of Africans. And within that strategy, the opportunities are to have investment projects which show what can be done. First of all, on the African continent, production has been increasing. To your point, it has not been increasing as quickly as it could be.
Right.
But it needs to accelerate. So there are good examples around the continent, and one of the things that we're trying to do is bring heads of states together to be able to commit to some of the lessons that are being learned. Because Africa, unlike some other parts of Asia, has a diverse range of agricultural produce. Number two, with regards to some of these projects, what's really happening is that there are so many small, medium enterprises. There's a quiet revolution that's going on, and about 80 to 90% of these food supply chains are actually these small, medium enterprises. So more and more we're trying to incorporate the support into these small, medium enterprises to be able to grow. Number three, in order to structure these value chains, we need to still support large companies to be able to give it structure. And I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement really brings a new dimension to those opportunities. And the second area where we see a lot of opportunities post-COVID, we'll see a lot of restructuring of these supply chains happening.
You made some very good points there. One of them is clearly, although you didn't say it quite as overtly, but clearly the challenge you must face trying to bring the politicians, the governments, in line to do what is needed to be done. The other thing was the issue of the small and medium enterprises, because the big problem, and I'm sure you know this, is particularly for those enterprises, a lack of access to capital. So if you're a small-scale farmer and you're able to produce only a ton, it most of the time never really grows beyond that because of a lack of access to capital.
Excellent question, Charles. And actually, I'm quite impressed, and also I'm very much encouraged. Actually, I'm here in Nigeria for a specific project called the Special Agro-industrial Processing Zones. And I used to live in Nigeria. I haven't been here for the past 4 years, and I see the extent to which the politicians, the government, the state governments support the growth of private sector. And I do believe that that is the engine, number one. Number two, infrastructure is growing. There is an acute shortage of infrastructure in Nigeria, but that is actually improving, and we see that there are efforts being made. With regards to the special agro-industrial processing zones, the basic thinking around that is that if we put the backbone infrastructure into rural areas, you will have small, medium enterprises be given an opportunity to invest, because many a times they do not have the access to markets, the access to finance, the access to infrastructure that's required to de-risk their investments. So the idea is to put that backbone infrastructure in place, to put the one-stop shop policy in place, and to your point, Charles, to put the finance in place. So we are partnering with the Bank of Industry to be able to support in these special agro-industrial processing zones the financing towards these small, medium enterprises that they would not have access to otherwise.
Right, okay, you've made again some very interesting points there. I want to talk a little bit about the one-stop shop, which is essentially really about information. We'll come to that in a minute, but the problem is that you talked about infrastructure, and clearly that is absolutely key. But the problem is that even after these infrastructure projects, such as we're seeing some in Nigeria, are completed, they are underutilized. For instance, rail transport, I mean, seems to focus heavily on passenger transport rather than freight transport. And what you're getting is very few passengers and one or two trains a day, for instance, in Abuja. I mean, is that the sort of thing you advise the government to do, or do they just sort of trip off on their own and do it? Because clearly freight would make more sense and you know, move stuff around the country and generate business and all that sort of thing.
In a country like Nigeria, Charles, you have two endowments that are incredibly strong. One is land, the other is labor. And so when we try to look at these infrastructures, it's very important to see where there's marketable surplus of commodities. So where you have a marketable surplus of whether it be rice, whether it be cassava, whether it be maize, it's incredibly important to link those to infrastructure. So only when you have that link do you have the returns on investment.
Absolutely.
And infrastructure is expensive. Two, there's also labor. So as we can retool, as we can skill the labor, definitely the infrastructure becomes one that provides much more return.
The right infrastructure.
Thank you.
And the other thing, the other big issue, you talked about the one-stop shop, is the lack of information. Because, I mean, for that small or medium enterprise to grow, it probably has to expand into export, for instance. But to export fish or something else like that to, for instance, Italy, the specifications for that market, there has to be information for that. I mean, and oftentimes they don't have that. And when they then ship to that country and the product is rejected, it affects not only that person who shipped it, but the entire market for other exporters from the exporting country, doesn't it? And that's the problem that you find in a place like Nigeria.
Well, Charles, you brought up so many important and interesting points. With regards to the one-stop shop, it's incredibly important to have the business intelligence that is required, number one. Number two, domestic markets in Nigeria are probably huger than anywhere we'll see in Africa. So the point is really to have the market intelligence around the domestic shops, the domestic market. And the one-stop shop is really to kind of cut the red tape, make the business registration process faster, make sure the land registration process is there, is really to have the interministerial coordination that's required even at the state level, and also to ensure that whatever happens on the ground is one that actually can deal with the private sector. That's really important. So I'd like to take you back to the special agro-industrial processing zones. These are spatially demarcated areas. These are in rural areas where there's a lot of produce.
Right.
This is where the infrastructure is lacking. We put in the infrastructure. In many cases, already access to markets is there. And then we make sure the private sector will come. So that's the whole idea around that.
Right, okay, that's obviously very interesting. We just saw today the figures for China come out. I expect as a Japanese, the Chinese make you a little bit nervous, don't they? But I mean, but actually, I tell you what, let's talk about that when we come back, because we've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Atsuko Toda, Acting Vice President for Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegulu, and my guest is Atsuko Toda, who has a lot of experience with international multilateral institutions, and last month she was appointed by the African Development Bank as its new acting vice president. Ms. Toda takes charge of the critical department of agriculture, human and social development. She's been at the bank since 2016 and has been responsible for its investments in agri-business companies and its development of special agro-industrial processing zones. So now that she's moved up the ladder, what will she bring to her new role in a continent that's desperate for agricultural innovation across the entire value chain? And the acting vice president for agriculture, human and social development at the African Development Bank, Atsuko Toda, is still with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us. And before we went on break, we were talking about, we're going to talk about China a little bit, but we're talking about the big issue of the lack of information. And you wanted to add something to that.
Absolutely. With regards to business information, market intelligence, the companies that are on the ground, they have it. The medium-sized enterprises, the small enterprises, it's those companies that are actually on the ground that have it. When we're talking about import and export markets, sub-Saharan Africa, Africa as a continent imports $75 billion worth of food. Now, when we're looking at a $1 trillion market by 2025, there are so many business opportunities that exist, and we cannot let imports be the solution. It must be local sourcing, local processing, local value chains, and resilient value chains on the continent.
That's a good point. We were talking about China again before we went on break. Figures just coming out showing that the economy there grew by 18% in the first quarter of 2021. That is a rocket growth, if you ask me. Obviously Japan, fairly close to China. It's also been an engine for global, it's the third biggest economy in the world, so it's an engine for huge growth around the world. But what's the secret of what the Chinese government has done to help its economy? Has it been keeping policy fairly stable? Because there hasn't really been a massive stimulus package such as we've seen in the US, has there? I'm wondering what their secret is.
I think there's two interesting and important points here, Charles. The first point is that China's rocketing growth, 18%, poses an amazing opportunity, an important opportunity for Africa. First of all, labor costs become more expensive on the Chinese side, and China as an emerging market is definitely a destination for Africa as it produces, processes, and can export to a larger and growing market. Secondly, with regards to the lessons that China provides, is really, as you were mentioning, some of the stability of policy and the openness actually to private sector development. While it remains government, it is very much private sector led, and there are different parts of the economy. I think these export processing zones was actually an idea in China that had tried to get more private sector investment in. It's been a steady policy, but steady growth over time.
So what policy choices would you urge the governments in Africa to adopt and possibly learn from China?
With regards to Nigeria, already the government is placing a lot of emphasis on the enabling business environment. Already the government is putting a lot of emphasis on youth, jobs, information technology. These are growth areas, and I think that's very important for Nigeria. And I believe that the agro-industrial policy is also very, very important for companies to continue to grow. Right.
As a bank, the African Development Bank lends money and finances projects in Africa, Nigeria, that sort of thing. One of the big problems that Nigeria has had recently, and what has created alarm, is the growing amount of debt that it's taking on. What is your sense, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, but what is your sense of the debt to GDP ratio here in Nigeria? It currently stands at around 35.5%. Does that make the debt situation still within reasonable limits?
There are multiple perspectives. With regards to the debt, it's really about the composition of debt. And two, it's about the effectiveness or the efficiency of the debt. So if the debt is being used on investment areas that produce a return, that are a productive investment, particularly as a country like Nigeria is growing, it's extremely important to allow for growth and also for domestic resource mobilization.
So does it concern you that Nigeria seems to be depending on loans to fund infrastructure projects as well as budget deficits?
I believe that with regards to Nigeria, there is also an element of being able to spend its own income to be able to invest further, number one. And number two, really this private sector engagement is very, very important on the debt management side.
Okay, well, let me not get you into that too much, because I know that I mean, politically you may not want to talk about that in public, but let's take another side of Nigeria. I mean, you have considerable experience here in this country. You were the country director for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, and a lot of your work had to do with rural development projects and value chain projects. Give us a sense of what you did in those two key areas here in Nigeria.
With regards to value chain development, it was really about supporting smallholder farmers, aggregation, about ensuring the linkages with off-takers. And I think too many times, especially with smallholders and aggregation, the processors are not running at full capacity. So the opportunities around linking, the entire value chain was very, very important. And I think with regards to IFAD, their strong focus on inclusive smallholder farmer development is really the key. And this is where 70% of people live in the rural areas, extremely important. And this is where the African Development Bank is trying to partner with the International Fund for Agricultural Development to accelerate or give more impetus to value chain development.
So what is your overall assessment as you become the Vice President for Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank? What's your overall, because I mean, agriculture is also tied to human and social development, because I mean that helps to sort of improve things. What's your overall assessment of where things are as you become Vice President and where you plan to take things going forward?
It's the most interesting and exciting time to take this position of acting vice president, especially in these sectors where we need to look at not only youth but jobs. We need to look at education, health, women together as we look at agriculture, agribusiness, agro-industrialization on a continent that's moving more quickly than any other continent in the world.
So that's where you want to take it, but where is it now?
I believe that there is already a lot of existing and emerging trends which are quite positive, and I think too many times we take Africa's example as not so positive, but it's actually, in fact, there's many exciting activities, including the fourth industrial revolution, the opportunities in IT, the small medium enterprises where there's a quiet revolution, a number of strong efforts by governments to support the private sector, and a lot of private sector interest in the growing domestic market and regional markets of Africa.
Okay, Atsuko Toda, Acting Vice President for Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank. I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and London, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.